Look at the no loitering, police enforced, deliveries must ring bell. The bottom windows are boarded up. You can see some of the paint is peeling off. And the windows, the sills are kind of sagging a little. It's definitely an old house. It's been around. Cool lantern style light there. Wow. This might be an original sill. Brick. I wonder if the steps are original. Marble steps like that can last a long time, but not sure. Well, hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about one of the great abolitionists in American history, the founder of the Philadelphia Vigilance Society and one of the documentarians and written archivists of the Underground Railroad. He was a founder of the Underground Railroad, and he lived right in this house, right here. According to the sign, he also helped found the YMCA, or the first black YMCA, I should say. So, it's interesting. Yeah, here's this house. Now, we're not actually going to spend too much time here because I actually want to show you a different place that is associated with William Still. And it's less well known than this house. This house is one of the houses that William Still stayed in Philly. And you should definitely come. I'm on the 200 block of South 12th Street near Tria. If you look over there is a very swanky wine bar called Tria. So if you're a local, you might know that. But yeah, I don't necessarily want to spend too much time on that building because I want to take you to a different building in the neighborhood. And while we get there, I'll tell you a little bit about who William Still was and why he's so important to Black history and the history of America in general. Now, okay, so before we get into William Still, one thing to understand is that Philadelphia was a very important place for abolition, black freedom, and black liberation movements. The reasons were fairly straightforward. Pennsylvania passed a law in 1780 that put it on the path to being the first state to abolish slavery. The Quakers, William Penn and the Quakers, they didn't believe in slavery, and they were peace-loving people who didn't believe in bondage of other humans. So Pennsylvania was always a bit of a safe haven for runaway slaves. Now, in the early days, in the 1700s, and there were definitely runaway slaves, but there wasn't like an organized effort to help runaway slaves. They were just doing what they can to get north. But by the 1800s, especially after the passage of this law in 1780, there were small groups forming to abolitionists who were forming to really, try to accelerate the abolition of slavery and help slaves who were running away and chasing their freedom, right? And Philadelphia being just north of the Mason-Dixon line, Philadelphia having passed this law, it had the largest black community in the country, and so there were a lot of free black people in the city, which I think I've heard the number 14,000, 20,000, something like that. There was a large free black community here, so this was a ripe area for abolition movements. And there were many groups that we'll go into at some point, probably, but you know, by the time William Still came along, there was already this very vibrant culture of a movement to help free black slaves, or free the slaves, and also prevent kidnappers from basically abducting people and dragging them back down south into slavery. Now, being abducted was a huge problem in Philadelphia. There was a law passed that allowed for slave catchers to come into Philly and basically kidnap former slaves and drag them back into slavery and return them to their masters, right? They were masters, right? And this was a huge problem. It was very dangerous to be a black person in Philly in the 1800s. We've talked about Richard Allen and others. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, you know how you can see exactly what would happen. Basically, there was a problem. Whether you were a former slave or not didn't really matter, because former slaves had manumission papers, right? And the manumission papers would have proved that you were a free black person who had gained their freedom. And when a slave catcher would catch someone, they'd often demand manumission papers to prove that they were free. I mean, or that was supposed to be what would happen, right? Of course, it never really did happen that way. The manumission papers didn't really matter, but this, regardless of whether this posed a big problem if you were born free. If you were a free black man, you didn't have manumission papers because you never were a slave to start with, right? So this was a huge problem. So people would get abducted, and they were free. They were born free black people in Philly, and they'd get abducted because they didn't have manumission papers. So they couldn't prove that they weren't slaves before, and then they'd get, sent south and forced to work on plantations. Yeah. Now, despite that danger, Philadelphia was nevertheless had a major black community, and was therefore a major hub for efforts to help free former slaves find freedom. And William Still came along with another gentleman named James Forten and a few others, and they started what became known as the Underground Railroad. And so William Still gets to be known as the founder and founding father of the Underground Railroad, and he lived right here in Philly in that house. But he also lived somewhere else. I'm going to show you this other place because I don't think even many people here in Philadelphia know it exists, let alone South Philly or the area around South Street, known as the 7th Ward, right? So I'm going to show you this spot. Now, who was William Still? William Still was a businessman. He made his fortune in coal mining in Pennsylvania, I believe. And he and his wife came here, and he's in Philadelphia and bought that house. His wife was a seamstress named Letitia, and they felt very strongly about abolition, and they got involved in basically setting up this network of associates down through Wilmington, Delaware, into the South, and through Baltimore and then further afield in Maryland and all the way into Virginia. And they set up this network of safe houses and known people who are friendly to runaway slaves, so that there was this informal network leading all the way up through Philly, and then continuing up through New Jersey, different pathways. There were many different pathways for the Underground Railroad, and they led to various places, but usually Philadelphia was just one of the stops, because Philly, again, was very dangerous. If you're a former slave, you're still very close to the South, and there were a lot of slave, kidnappers and slave, people who chased slaves, and it was just not great. So a lot of people in Philly, they continued up through New York and then eventually to Canada, and that was sort of the Underground Railroad as the full extent, from all the way from the South, as deep into the South as you can go, all the way to Mississippi and Louisiana, all the way up through to Canada. And Philadelphia was the major stop, where a lot of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and different parts of Pennsylvania became major hubs for the Underground Railroad. And William Still was instrumental in organizing the Underground Railroad here in Philadelphia. Now, I guess since we're on the topic, one thing that I think a lot of people don't know is, what does Underground Railroad even mean? Why is it called the Underground Railroad? There wasn't a railroad associated with it. It's not like there were train cars carrying free slaves around. So what's the deal? And why underground? I think there's this modern notion of an underground movement being something clandestine, and I don't know exactly if that connotation with the word underground was true back then. It may well have been that when a clandestine or rebel movement that kind of goes against the status quo or is not sanctioned by authorities gets going, it was called an underground movement. I don't know that, but that's not exactly what the word underground means in the term Underground Railroad. It doesn't have anything to do, I don't think it really had much to do with a clandestine or rebel movement. That's not what it meant. Instead, the term Underground Railroad was actually sort of a colloquial word that kind of meant something that would never exist or was impossible, right? It actually meant, it was sort of unthinkable to people that you could have a railroad beneath the surface of the earth. At the time, railroads were brand new things. In one of my early videos, I brought you to the Leaper House in Delaware County, where the very first railway was built in America as a way of transporting rocks from a quarry to Ridley Creek, where the tidewaters came up from the Delaware, and on the quarried stone could then be transported down Ridley Creek, down the Delaware, and out across the eastern seaboard, to help build all sorts of mansions and famous places in America. That was what Thomas Leaper's first railway was, a horse-drawn carriage, and he actually tested it here in Philly too. So, but railways were these brand new technologies that were very fantastical to people, and so there were all sorts of legends and myths about the railways. Whenever a new technology comes along, people are like, sort of think of it as magic. I guess you could sort of think of computers, like, how do those work, right? You open up a computer and it looks really crazy. So you can kind of imagine people thinking that they're a little, that basically new technology breeds this mysticism. And the railways certainly had this folklore, and this the scale of them and everything was very impressive to people. But of course, the railways run on the surface of the earth. They run across on the ground, and so to think about an underground railway was like crazy. It was a bit like saying pigs flying. Pigs don't fly, right? But It's sort of like, so people would say things like, when pigs fly, that'll happen, or sure, take the Underground Railroad, whatever, you're never gonna make it, that kind of thing. So it was sort of like unicorns, pigs flying, Underground Railroads, all these nonsensical, fantastical things, So that's where the term Underground Railroad came from. It was sort of this thing that was a mystical idea that it didn't really exist, did it? Nah, not really. And yet, sure enough, that's what the pathway, these pathways through up through Wilmington and then. All right, so the camera cut off, but what I was trying to say is all those paths up through Pennsylvania became known as the Underground Railroad. So another thing I wanted to mention, we're almost at the place now, we're coming up on it, but before we get there, I wanted to mention that, for Black people in America, genealogy is super important. It's a major thing because, when Black people were taken from Africa, they lost their history of family history. There's cultural erasure, where a lot of Black people don't know where exactly in Africa they have ancestry. And then, of course, when families, through slavery, children were sold from parents. Parents were often killed and otherwise, lost to history. So there's no real way of telling where someone came from. And that means that a lot of people just don't know who their families are. It's one of the reasons why, for instance, Malcolm X was called X as opposed to taking another last name. A lot of people took names from their masters, the slave masters, and that's not good. So Malcolm X rejected his given name, instead took the X. So yeah, to bring it back to William Still. William Still was he was one of many children. I want to say 18 children, but at least a dozen children. So he had a dozen siblings, and when he sought freedom, his mother sent the boys, him and his brother, to find freedom because she thought that would be more likely they would be more likely to gain their freedom successfully than her daughters. So William Still was sent by his mom to find freedom, and he did successfully, but in doing so he lost touch with all of his other siblings and all his other family, right? It was a huge tragedy. Gosh, it's a beautiful day, so there's a lot of activity around. It's hard to get a free moment. I don't want to bother anybody, but we'll get to the house in a sec. I think the last thing I want to say before we do that is just to point out that one of the things that makes William Still, building off this notion about ancestry and keeping families together and families being broken apart by slavery, one of the things that makes William Still so significant in history is that he kept a record of the freed slaves and runaways who passed through his house. Every runaway slave that came through his house, he wrote their name down. He asked where they were from. He asked anything they knew about their family, and any identifying information he could take about them, he wrote it down. So there's actually this beautiful notebook in I believe it's either in the Philadelphia Historical Society or the Chester Historical Society, but his notebook exists, and there are many significant names in that notebook that are worth checking out. Of course, one of those names is Harriet Tubman, and Harriet Tubman famously was known as Black Moses, or simply Moses, because she shepherded many slaves to freedom. And together, William Still helped thousands of slaves. Harriet Tubman helped hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves. I'm sure there are exact numbers. I looked and tried to find exact numbers for both Harriet Tubman and William Still, and I got conflicting sources. So if someone knows exact numbers of how many people each of them helped, please leave a comment with that information in the comments section. But essentially, they helped hundreds and thousands of slaves escape. And one of the cool things is that because Harriet Tubman undoubtedly came to stay with William Still, she went to William Still's house. So wherever this house I'm about to show you in a moment it's undoubtedly a place where Harriet Tubman also went. And the final thing I want to tell you is a story, because Harriet Tubman brought someone on one of her runs, one of her expeditions. She brought someone to William Still, who, when he started interviewing this person for his history and for his notebook, started recognizing some of the stories that this guy was telling. His name was Peter. And some of the people that this guy Peter mentioned, William Still was like, hey, that reminds me of my grandma, or, oh, that reminds me of my other siblings. What do you say your name was? And it turns out that this guy Peter was actually William Still's brother. So just imagine that. Imagine your own siblings. You're sitting there interviewing runaway slaves, and suddenly you realize you're talking to your own brother, who you haven't seen since you were a child. Just imagine what that moment would have been like for both of them. It's amazing. Okay, there's the house. This is William Still's house. And there's no historical marker because it's not very well known. So you'll notice there's no historical marker pointing out William Still's house. Now back here is, this is a school that was started it was called the Institute for Colored Youth. And it became Cheney University. So it's a very important building, but we'll cover that in another video. For now, we're going to talk about this house right here. So you can see way up there is the historic marker, marking this house as a historic property. And I asked the person who lives here if it's okay to film, and they said yes, so thank you for that. And this is the main attraction that I actually came here to show you. It's these steps right here, because I don't know if the rest of this facade is original or not. It may be. There's actually a PBS documentary that came here recently, and maybe they filmed, maybe they figured out whether it's original or not. But these steps are almost certainly original. And you can see that they're super worn down. I mean, look at the divots. Look at how uneven the stairs are. And that's from, that sort of slope is from thousands of footsteps over time, wearing away the stone. And it's made of marble, so you know it's a hard stone for sure. And these being original, and knowing that Harriet Tubman hung out and came here to bring runaway slaves to William Still, it is almost certain that Harriet Tubman herself crossed this threshold and stood on these steps right there. So, yep, just a random building in South Philadelphia on a random street. Unmarked, unknown. I don't know if many South Philadelphians even know that these steps are so historic in Philadelphia, but there they are, Harriet Tubman herself. So let me take one stand, walking in the footsteps of a legend. And man, even as I'm standing, I can feel the divots of thousands of footsteps. Yeah. Yeah, those were the steps, and I think it's important. I hope they get a proper historic marker at some point. But if not, at least we've seen it now. So no matter what happens, we've documented it. Yeah, and that's about it. I wanted to show you where William Still lived. It's the second place he lived, and it's not very well known. So there's a little bit of hidden history, Philadelphia, for you. Yeah. Please leave a comment if you know more about that house or the story behind it. Any other details would be great. William Still was a really great guy and very important person, so I think we need to celebrate him more, and I don't know what to do about that more. Maybe people have better ideas, but maybe we can have a Philadelphia Day for William Still, or maybe a statue. I like statues. Don't we all like statues? So I don't know. We could do something, but okay. I think I'll leave it there. So my name's Sean. This is my channel, Saul Good, and please like the video so that the algorithm knows how important the history of William Still is. And then also subscribe if you like these history walks and talks. And yeah, leave a comment if you know any more. So thanks. Okay, bye.